Hi, Setha. Really pleased to have you here today.
Hi, Carl. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to talk about public space and civic life. Let me get started. Hi, I want to talk about a book that I'm just now completing called Why Public Space Matters. And today I'm going to share a little bit about the threats and opportunities that we have when we're thinking about public spaces in general, and of course, urban parks more specifically. We all know that public space matters at individual and in community level, relaxing and recreating and reviving and remembering. But public space also matters at a societal and a global level. These are the symbolic centers of civic life, the forum for discussion. It's where racial and cultural diversity is recognized and information is circulated. It's where we really expand the public sphere. And for that reason, we are all advocating, and I know I'm in a group of people that are really comfortable with that, we're talking about public space for all or public space for everyone. And I guess the question is, how do we create public space for all or public space for everyone? Because we agree public space provides the potential for civic life, for discussion, cooperation, and at times conflict. And because many of us are committed to civic life in a just city, which includes and based on diversity, equity, inclusion, and recognition of the right to the city, we've been doing research at the Public Space Research Group to identify social processes, power dynamics, and design and planning decisions that influence whether this happens or not. We have come up with this graphic, which is only a schematic or a heuristic, as you would say, of at least 4 areas of threat, of everyday threat to public space. And what I'm going to do in this talk is just talk about some of the details of what we've worked out. And it includes a lack of representation, certain kinds of privatization, securitization, especially post 9/11 in the United States, but also in the UK and in Western Europe, and social injustice. Let me start with lack of representation. The erasure of local history is one of the greatest threats to people not using a public space like a park. Here is Independence National Park, which is in Philadelphia. It's where the Declaration of Independence in the United States was signed. And we were tasked with trying to find out why African Americans and Spanish-speaking Puerto Rican Americans and actually Vietnamese and all kinds of different ethnic groups were not using the park. And what we learned was that originally this area was full of landmarks, including the first cemetery, the first burying ground for African Americans. It also held the first churches and all of the institutions that were important, say, to the African American committee. But when we went and interviewed African Americans who live only, a quarter mile from this site, a half mile from this site, they said the only thing there that was Black was the signatures on the Declaration of Independence. None of their sites, none of the institutions, they had all been erased in a gentrification process in which this park was turned into a representation of, this case, a white male colonial space that all was around 1776. So all of the representations of African Americans, and I will point out later, there are no Spanish tours, even though a large proportion of Philadelphians only speak Spanish. These are reasons people don't use park. Here's another example, which is really interesting. This is Pelham Bay Park, in which originally was a white working class park, and then the Bronx becomes very Hispanic and Latino, I mean Spanish speaking, and also Latin American immigrants. And they did a wonderful job of developing a summer music project and drawing people from all over the Bronx to celebrate the cultural heritage of their countries where they had come from. But they did so in such a way that erased the cultural symbols of those people who had come before them. So a loss of cultural symbols or even a replacement can in fact lessen the diversity and use of your park. Sometimes there's restoration of parks. This is Prospect Park Boathouse. Central Park also does this a lot, and actually parks all over the US, especially our large historical parks, often restore historical monuments, but they don't restore their social function, and therefore no one uses it. So it's the history in and of itself is only read as important by mostly a white professional class. At least this is the case in Prospect Park. I know this isn't the case so much in the UK, but at least in many countries, that restoration, historic restoration, does not necessarily increase social functioning. And finally, excuse me, it looks like, no. Jacob Riis Park. This is a very large park, a beach, where there are inadequate territories for everyone to be. This is a park that different people want to be with each other. And I know we talk about diversity, but diversity happens best when there are adequate territories for everyone, and then spaces where everyone can mix. A second set of threats to public spaces are based on different forms of privatization. And I know we all are part of the era of privatization, and one would argue without it, we wouldn't have our beautiful parks. But there are also risks involved in privatization. In the first case, privatization can include commercialization, and it can be so intense that the commercialization really doesn't speak to the users, or in fact suggests that users need to have money or need to be able to buy these appropriations. Two, there's increasing controlled access of space. This is Herald Square, that was an open space where young teenagers used to hang out at night. It was very popular with young people who don't have many places to be in New York City. It was taken over by a BID, a business improvement district, cleaned up, but it was also fenced in, given a entrance, and with extremely controlled access. It is patrolled all the time. There are ambassadors or members of the BID who are constantly patrolling, and it is closed at 8 o'clock at night, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 10 o'clock in summer, and teenagers no longer have a place to go. There's also an issue with privatizations. There can be an over-regulation of space. I always show you this, the list of rules of conduct. If you look really carefully, if you can't play and can't run and can't bicycle and can't do so many things, it really does speak to youth again, and often youth of color, and when we're talking about the United States, around issues. But it also does speak to, I would argue, other kinds of youth, that they're not wanted when you have these kinds of rules. But there are also other kinds of overregulation that make a place not comfortable to be, such as, this is a sitting wall that was designed specifically by the landscape architects to sit on. And you can see this sign that says, please don't sit or place objects on the wall. This is, where we begin to create affordances in parks that can't be used because of the overregulation that often comes with private public partnerships, or with certain kinds of tightly controlled downtown spaces that are part of a BID. And finally, something that I think is even harder for us to manage, but equally important, is the financialization or a financialized moral geography. What do I mean by that? I mean that with privatization and public-private partnerships can often come the feeling that people who don't have money or who need money or are less valued in terms of users than people who come and say buy a cappuccino or are somehow financially, morally better. And this kind of new morality that has been around and has certainly evolved, at least in the United States, in the last 20 years, and we kind of call it part of neoliberalism, is detrimental to people coming together and detrimental in public spaces being for all, including even on the sidewalk. If you interview people like we have, you will find that they are very sensitive to not having the means for either the aesthetics that don't invite them in, or simply don't have feel morally inferior because they don't have the money to enter or participate at the level being represented in the space. Now, securitization has really developed in the United States since 9/11 and all over the world with a threat of tourism. But securitization has always been with us. And we actually have extremely good data at this point that stop and frisk policing in the United States keeps people out of parks. If you interview in minority neighborhoods or marginalized neighborhoods or even just very diverse neighborhoods where there is extreme policing, by that I mean you can be stopped and at any point for any reason, that most of the neighborhood will abandon the park and it's not seen as a safe place. I can give you a great example where this caused problems during COVID, in that during COVID, the parks in New York City and the Bronx were heavily policed and with lots of stop and frisk and lots of ticketing for not wearing masks or not being spaced enough. And so as soon as things opened up a little bit, kids from the Bronx started coming down to Midtown Manhattan, where the parks don't have this zero tolerance policing, and where it's much freer to play and party and stay up late at night. Because remember, young people didn't have places to go. All the clubs were closed and, they were really looking for a social world. And there were complaints in the downtown parks of Manhattan that there was noise. Well, of course, there'd always been noise, but this is a different group of young people. And they were saying, well, they'd only come down because there was such policing in their spaces. They wanted to go where there was less. But of course, there's also surveillance. And what I've shown you here, and I'm also showing you here, that it's not just the United States, because the pictures here where it says Fuerza Pública, this is Costa Rica, that surveillance has really intensified in the plazas that I originally studied all throughout Latin America. These are towers that you could really imagine don't necessarily really encourage the use of the space. This is back in the United States, where barriers as well as bollards, just the physicality of security really reduces use. And, excuse me, in that racial and cultural profiling happens not just in the US. It's the fact that police target kids, young people of color is one thing, and Black Lives Matters all over the world is trying to address this. But this other slide is from Costa Rica, and these are Nicaraguans who live in Costa Rica who are being profiled by the police here in this public space and being talked to and interviewed without particularly any means. Which leads us to my final final category, which is social justice. And I've been writing a lot about social injustice and in the importance of justice in the role of park use. We've talked about an unfair distribution of space. This is the Bronx in the top, and this is Central Park in the bottom. But there's more than just distributive injustice. There's often a lack of procedural justice. This is a slide that talks about what happened in the Mission in San Francisco when a park was taken over and privatized or being controlled, and that suddenly it cost $27 to use the soccer fields where the people had been using it for the past 40 years, and they were not invited or even aware that decisions were being made to make it cost money to play soccer in the park. There's also a lack of recognition of difference. This is a slide actually from Tel Aviv. This is a famous park where Eritrean and Sudanese immigrants who have come to Israel spend the day because they are not recognized as having a place in this society, and they are not provided with housing. And where do they end up? They're in the public park, but they're in the public park here without the resources and supports and without recognition that their lives matter as well. And then the final slide is, these are two young men sparring in a space called Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I think is a private park that's very successful, but police came over because there was a lack of understanding of what we call interactional justice here, that these kids were doing a recognized form of play, but that's not even understood by the authorities, and therefore this lack of interactional justice could keep them away. Now, these threats to public space can all be reversed. And in this final slide, I just want to sort of show you the flip side of what I've been talking about. Instead of a lack of representation, we want evidence of local history. We should retain the cultural symbols that are there, restore the social functions when we do historic reconstructions, provide adequate territories for all desired activities if we want the kind of diversity and use of our parks. Privatization really, when we're entering into this new phase of privatization, let's think about open access, free activities and events. I limit regulation as much as possible. And let's turn to cooperation and collaboration instead of profiling, exclusion, bollards that we've been using. Through collaboration, we know there's a tremendous amount of evidence that a lot can be achieved, or co-production, as Julian Ajuman says. Securitization, we know that community policing works better. People watching can keep people safe. In New York, we've been increasing flexible and porous boundaries of parks and respect and understanding. I'm sorry. And finally, social injustice. Fair distribution of space, procedural justice, social and political recognition, and interactional justice for all can keep our public spaces alive for civic life and make them a place where everyone wants to be. Thank you.